Thanks so much. Did you have a good break? Good, good. Well, our next talk is about how it's very practical on how to do apologetics. And I mentioned earlier that I had become a Christian at L'Abri. I was about 20 years old. And when I arrived, I was 19. I was the youngest student there. Nobody else was that young. But when I became a Christian, because apologetics had been such a big part of my own conversion, and I finally found answers to so many questions, that afterwards I felt very responsible to answer other people's questions. Right? I felt I had to know every objection out there and every answer to every objection. And, well, I pretty soon realized that would take a lifetime. So in the process of writing my book, Finding Truth, which is the topic for this lecture, I discovered a strategy that cuts to the heart of any worldview. It's a plan of action that you can apply anywhere. And so you don't have to memorize every worldview out there like I thought I had to do. And what's even more exciting is it comes from Scripture. It comes from Romans 1. In Romans, Paul is writing to a congregation that he had not spoken to before. And so he lays out the case for God's existence in an especially clear way. In fact, I sometimes call this Paul's apologetics training manual. And I'll be asking you a lot of questions, so think back to the last time you read Romans 1. Where does Paul start in laying out his case? See how well you can remember Romans 1. Where does Paul begin in sort of making his, after greeting his audience, he begins right away in making a case for Christianity, for God's existence. What does he say? Well, he starts out by saying everyone has access to evidence for God. From what? From the created order. Right. And by the way, I hope you can read the verses because I don't have time to read all the verses. You'll have to read them for yourself from where you're sitting. So most people, when they read about evidence of God in creation, they think of nature, right? So let's start there. How does nature give evidence for God? I'm going to zero in on just the two smoking guns, so to speak, because this is not a science lecture. The origin of the universe and the origin of life. For the origin of the universe, there is what scientists call the fine-tuning problem, and that is that the fundamental constants of the universe, like the force of gravity, the charge of the electron, the expansion rate of the universe, and so on, all of these must have exactly the value that they do have for any kind of life to exist. An article in the New York Times put it this way: these mysterious numbers are like the knobs on God's control console. They seem almost miraculously tuned for life. No, this guy's not even a Christian, but he sees the implications of the fine-tuning. And what makes it so puzzling is that there's no physical cause. So here's astronomer George Greenstein, again, not a Christian. Nothing in all of physics explains why its fundamental principles should conform themselves so precisely to life's requirement. Or as astrophysicist Paul Davis puts it, it's almost as if a grand designer had it all figured out. By the way, Paul Davies did go from being an atheist to being a deist. That's what he calls himself, a deist. He doesn't want a personal God, but he can't deny the evidence for God in the universe. So that's the origin of the universe, the origin of life. Today, the most popular analogy is a computer, that the hardware is the DNA molecule, because that's the physical molecule, the physical chain of compounds linked together. And the software is like the DNA code, right? That's the genetic information. once you catch that distinction, you'll understand why all of the origin of life experiments have failed. It's because all of them have tried to get the chemical elements to link up in a test tube. In other words, they address the hardware, but not the software. Let me give you another quote from the same Paul Davies. He says, attempts at chemical synthesis of life focus exclusively on the hardware, the chemical substrate of life, but they ignore the software, which is the informational aspect. And yet, every kid with a laptop knows that chemistry alone will not explain life's origin any more than a study of silicon, copper, and plastic, that is the hardware of a computer, will explain how a computer can execute a program. In other words, you can't put the physical components together and get Windows 10. Back when Paul was writing to the Romans, people recognized the evidence for God in nature even without the benefit of modern science. So a century before Christ, the great Roman writer Cicero said, when we see something moved by machinery, like an orrery, that's a mechanical model of the planets. You couldn't say solar system back then, right? Because they didn't know it was a so you had to say planetary system, or a clock, or many other such things. We do not doubt that these contrivances are the work of reason. He keeps going. When, therefore, we behold the whole compass of heaven, moving with revolutions of marvelous velocity and perfect regularity, how can we doubt that all this is affected not merely by reason, but by a reason that is transcendent and divine? And he ends up, you see not the deity, yet by contemplation of his works you are led to acknowledge a God. So the audience that Paul was addressing knew as well as we do that the cosmos gives evidence of a mind that is transcendent and divine. And by the way, that orrery, that's an actual orrery. It was found under the Mediterranean Sea, and that's the original, and that's a model of it. And news reports said it was so complex that they called it the world's first analog computer. So what is a theological term that we use when we talk about evidence from nature? You can, go ahead and call it out. If you think of the answer when I raise a question, please just call it out. Let's make it a little more interactive. What is the evidence for God from nature? Yes. All right, Paul, what is general revelation? Now, the thing is, most people, when they hear that term, they do think mostly of evidence from the physical world, right? But it also means evidence from human nature. Right? You and I are part of the created order, and we too give evidence for God. Here's the principle. The cause must be equal to the effect. So because humans are capable of knowing, the first cause that created them must have a mind. Because humans are capable of choosing, the first cause that created them must have a will. Or as one philosopher sums it up, a Catholic philosopher, because a human is a someone and not a something, the source of human life must also be a someone, a personal being, and not the blind automatic forces of nature, as philosophies like naturalism or materialism would tell us. But the Old Testament already made this argument. Does he who fashioned the ear not hear? Does he who formed the eye not see? That's the same argument. He's saying that the origins of humanity must have at least the same capabilities that humans have. And this may explain why children in every culture have a concept of God. There's a psychologist at Yale University who studies children, and he says, when children are directly asked about the origin of animals and people, they tend to prefer explanations that involve an intentional creator, even if the adults who raised them do not. In other words, even if their parents are atheists, the kids believe in God. It appears that we have to be educated out of belief in God by secular schools and media. Now, if the evidence for creation, from creation, impinges on everybody's consciousness, why don't all people acknowledge God? What does Romans 1 say? Why don't people acknowledge God? Yeah, actually, you're jumping one step ahead. Yeah. First of all, they suppress the knowledge of God, right? And what's the main way that humans suppress the evidence for God? And that's where your answer comes in. They take something from creation, right? You said they worship something in creation. Exactly. In other words, they create an idol. An idol is anything in the created order that is treated as the ultimate reality, or absolutized, put in the place of God. And obviously, it doesn't have to be something concrete like a golden calf. It can be something abstract. Think of the idols that many people live for, like career success, professional achievement, or even relationships. Or think of something abstract like matter. Is matter part of the created order? Sure. So materialism, the philosophy of materialism, qualifies as an idol in the biblical sense. It puts matter in the place of God as the ultimate, eternal, uncaused cause of everything else. What about reason? Can reason be an idol? Yeah. The philosophy of rationalism puts human reason in the place of God as the source and standard of all truth. Albert Einstein called himself a believing rationalist. Isn't it an interesting phrase? He understood that it was a complete, full-blown creed. So this is the human condition in Romans 1. On the one hand, people are aware of the evidence for the biblical God from the created order. And on the other hand, they keep suppressing that evidence by creating God substitutes. We can borrow a term from psychology and call this cognitive dissonance. Do you know that term? Cognitive dissonance. It's where you believe two contradictory things. So what does God do to break people out of their cognitive dissonance, according to Romans 1? Some of you brought it up on your iPhones. Well, he ratchets up the tension, right? He gets us up to follow our idols. Why does he do that? His goal is to get through to us by intensifying the cognitive dissonance. You know, you and I probably wouldn't do that. It's not the way most of us would do in talking to a non-Christian. But God is trying to get through to people by actually ratcheting up the tension. And that's why the chapter ends with a long list of violence and oppression. You probably remember that part. You know, disobedient to parents and killing one another and so on. The whole end of the second half of the chapter is all about people committing violence against one another. So the point is to press people to the point of decision. Will they continue to worship a counterfeit God even when it's destroying them, or will they repent and turn to the true God? This does raise a question, though. Why is it that idols inevitably lead to destructive and self-destructive behavior? Well, the answer is that idols always lead to a lower view of humanity. Think about it this way. If we are made in the image of a transcendent personal creator, what happens if you substitute an idol? Your definition of humanity will be recast in the image of that idol. Let me show you what I mean. So materialism, I'm going to focus a lot on materialism, by the way, because it is the dominant worldview on the secular university campus today. If you're a materialist, what's your idol? Your idol is matter. And what will you say then about human beings? You will redefine them as complex biochemical machines. No soul, no spirit, no free will, no mind. Nothing beyond the realm of the physical. And the cutting edge today among cognitive scientists is that there's not even a consciousness. Consciousness is an illusion. So the principle here is that your view of humanity will always be in the image of whatever you define as your idol, whatever you define as the ultimate reality. And because an idol will always be lower or less than the transcendent personal creator of the Bible, it's always going to be something in the created order. And so it will always lead to a low view of the human being. You only have to learn one technical term here. Reductionism. See the word on the top of the slide? Reductionism. In philosophy, that means reducing something to a lower status of value. And Romans sums it up by saying, idols lead to a debased mind, or we might say a dehumanizing worldview. In the original Greek that the New Testament is written in, the word debased was used for counterfeit money. Well, even today we talk about a debased currency, right? So the word has connotations of not giving something its full value. And when you have a low view of the value of human life, how are you going to treat people? You're going to treat them as less than human. And this is easiest to see if we flesh it out in history. The 20th century was the bloodiest century ever. And the carnage was driven mostly by atheist totalitarian ideologies, right? Nazism, communism. So let's talk about idols. What was the idol in Nazism? What was the single category that it used to define a person's worth and value? What was its reductionism? Actually, I'm not hearing it. What? Say it a little louder. Race. Yeah, absolutely. The Nazis claimed to be Aryans, whatever that meant. And if you were the wrong race, if you were Jewish, if you were Slavic, if you were Gypsy, you could be herded into ghettos, shipped off in boxcars to concentration camps, and thrown into the ovens. Communism, what's the idol of communism? The single category that determined your value. Class, economic class. Yes, economic class. Capitalist versus proletarian, right? If you were the wrong class, you could be put in prison, shipped off in boxcars to hard labor camps, and worked to death or shot. So this explains why Romans 1 starts out with idols and ends with a long list of destructive behavior. We might say a debased mind leads to debased behavior. Those who dishonor God will end up dishonoring themselves and others. So Romans 1 gives us a fascinating analysis where worldviews come from and where they go wrong. So how can we sort of pull out a strategy here for analyzing worldviews? What would you propose as sort of the first step, given what we just went through? If you're looking at a new set of ideas that you've never encountered before, you've picked up a book on some philosophy or some religion or some new age thought that you'd never encountered before, what would be your starting point based on what we've learned from Romans 1? Well, how about the idol, right? If every non-Christian worldview has to exchange the glory of God for something in the created order and turn that into an idol, let's start by identifying the idol. What does it propose as the eternal, ultimate, self-existing reality? You can think of a worldview as kind of a box. You're trying to stuff all of reality into a box. And I'm using materialism again as my example on the slide. It's the box of matter. And by the way, you know, I teach undergrads and graduate students, and they often get totally overwhelmed when they encounter some new idea or philosophy. They don't know where to start. So I say, start by finding the idol. Everything else is going to flow logically from that. What is their ultimate reality? In fact, what's the first thing that flows from that based on what we just went through in Romans 1? Your idol will determine what's the next step. You guys speak so softly. I'm glad you're offering answers, but... Value, human value. Thank you. Yes. Oops, I just touched the screen. Did I mess it up? Yeah, that's correct. It's fine. Yes, value. The reductionism. What is its view of human beings? How does it devalue? See, you got the right word even. How does it devalue the human person? See, if a worldview is like a box that you're trying to stuff the whole universe in, the problem is that no matter what box you choose, it's never big enough to explain all of reality. And by the way, how can you be sure of that? Why can you be absolutely certain that any non-Christian worldview is going to be too small to account for all of reality? You can be absolutely certain. Because it's part of the created order. Right? Paul has already told us they're going to exchange the glory of God for something in the created order. Because after all, what else is there? There's God and there's the created order. So if you take something from the created order and you're going to redefine all reality in terms of that part of creation, a part is never big enough to explain the whole. So you can be absolutely confident that every non-Christian worldview out there is going to be too small, so to speak, to explain the whole thing. So here's my, oops. So my example from materialism again. If humans, it's reductionism, as humans are biochemical machines, and that free will, mind, consciousness, soul, spirit, etc., are illusions. There's a psychologist at Harvard who just wrote a book called The Illusion of Conscious Will. Okay, so that's the first two principles that we drew out is basically how to analyze a non-Christian worldview. Now, how about testing a worldview? There's two basic types of questions that you ask any idea, whether it's in the science lab or the courtroom or when your child is explaining why he didn't do his homework. And so what would these two types of questions, what would they be?
What's the outcome? What comes out of it?
Well, I'm not sure that was what I was thinking of, although that's a good question to ask. I'm actually probably thinking more simply than you are. The first one is just, does it fit the facts? That's very simple. If somebody offers you an explanation for something, the first thing you're thinking is, does it fit the facts? And the second thing would be, well, let me see if you, what would the second one be? Yes, that's a good question too. I was thinking of, does it hold together logically? First, does it fit the facts? Does it hold together logically? Because you know that if it contains a logical contradiction, it cannot be true, right? I mean, today, when you talk to undergraduates, they don't always agree with you. If I say God exists and God does not exist, that one sentence contains a logical contradiction, therefore it cannot be true, right? So anything that contains a logical contradiction cannot be true. So let's look at those two. Let's see if this will work since I just touched it. There you go. So, does it fit the facts? And you can be confident, again, that any belief system that starts with an idol is going to fail this test. Why? Like I just said, the box is going to be too small. A part is always too small to explain the whole. It will always leave some things out. So the materialist may say we are machines, But in practice, can anyone really function as a machine? No. We all make choices from the moment we wake up in the morning. And we certainly don't treat our children like machines. Actually, I'm going to give you some examples later. But one philosopher puts it this way. If you don't think there's such a thing as free will, then when you order at a restaurant, you should say, just bring me whatever the laws of nature have determined I will get. So to use that word cognitive dissonance again, the materialist always has cognitive dissonance because some part of reality will not fit into his box, right? It'll stick out of the box. And then does it hold together logically? Okay, and you can be confident that when a worldview starts with an idol, it will be self-contradictory. It will be self-defeating. Why? Because of the reductionism. See, if you reduce the human person to something less than fully human, that includes our cognitive capacities, our mind, our rationality, reason. But how do they argue their own case? They have to use reason, right? So when they debunk reason, they undercut their own case. I'm going to give you several examples, so this will be not so abstract. But using materialism again on the screen. According to materialism, our ideas are not really true or false. They're just products of neurons firing in our brains. But to be logically consistent, that rule must be applied to materialism itself, which means it's not true either. It's just a product of neurons firing in our brains. So do you see how the theory is self-refuting? When its concept of truth is applied to itself, it destroys itself. It slits its own throat. The technical term here for this is self-referential incoherence. But my students prefer it when I say, this is how a worldview commits suicide. It destroys itself. And then the last principle, we have 5 principles in this book, and that makes a case for Christianity. We'll get to that at the very end. So now I want to go through several examples so that you get some practice actually using these steps. And I'm going to start with number 4. Is that working? Yeah. Okay, how non-biblical worldviews are self-refuting, how they commit suicide. Now, some of you may know, you may be familiar with C.S. Lewis, his famous argument against naturalism. Are you familiar with his argument against naturalism, C.S. Lewis? Most Christians have read C.S. Lewis, so if you haven't, you should. But this was his argument. I'm sorry, it's sliding around a bit, and I'm not always sure if it takes. Okay, yeah, it's taking. Okay, here was his famous argument against naturalism. So what is naturalism? Naturalism is the only thing that exists is nature. Pretty simple definition. Nature is all that exists. There's no supernatural, etc. There's nothing that can't be reduced to natural processes. So Lewis argued that if our ideas are products of natural forces, then they're just a natural process, right? Sort of like digestion. But digestion is not true or false, right? It's just a physical process. It's a fact. So if our ideas are products of natural forces, then they're not true or false either, including the idea of naturalism. So naturalism has just undercut itself. It's self-refuting. Do you see his logic here? Oh, good. Good. Yeah, and there's a philosopher at USC, University of Southern California, who is a naturalist. By the way, he says naturalism is the religion of our day, at least in the academy. And he says, he argues that thinking is like digestion. It's just a natural process. And so he says we should call it mentation, to show the parallel with digestion. But it turns out, when I was a young Christian and I read C.S. Lewis, I thought, wow, that's a great argument against naturalism. And then I realized, hey, it's a great argument you can use anywhere. So let's apply it to some of the philosophies that are common in the university today. Let's start with Marxism. Now, Marxism, everywhere it's actually applied, has led to poverty and totalitarianism. And yet, ironically, it's still highly influential, especially on the university campus. A French philosopher said, nowadays, when we want to debate a Marxist, we have to import one from an American university. So what is the idol of Marxism? We covered it earlier. Do you remember? Well, we said communism, but what is the idol for Marxism? Yeah, good. Economic class, or economic interests. And in other words, Marxism says you think the way you do not because you're rationally persuaded it's true, but because it advances your economic interests. For example, he said the source of Christianity, the reason it exists is that people use it to oppress the poor. It was invented by the rich and powerful to subjugate the poor, promising them that they will be compensated for their misery in this life by happiness in the afterlife. So the rich use religion to advance their own economic interests. How does Marxism commit suicide? How is it self-refuting? To be logically consistent, he has to apply his own argument to itself, right? So did he come up with his theory only to advance his own economic interests? In that case, why should the rest of us pay any attention to it? So it undercuts itself. It shoots itself in the foot. You catch it? You see how he does that? His own definition of truth gets applied to itself. What about Freud? Freud's already on the list. Freud has had an enormous impact on the modern mind. He said, you believe what you believe not because you're rationally persuaded it's true, but because of because of sexual repression, right? Because of your psychological history and especially your sexual repression. You're a Christian because of your Oedipus complex. What does that imply for Freud's own theory? Onto the couch yourself, Dr. Freud. Where did you get your theories from? If our theories are all inventions of our sexual repression, and by the way, historians are going back now and saying he did have a very abusive father, and maybe that does account for some of his views. So a fast-growing field today, especially on the college campus, is evolutionary psychology. It says our brains evolved by natural selection. Well, then, so did the ideas in our brains. The ideas that stay in our brains stick around. It's not because of their truth value, but because of their survival value. And if you apply that theory to itself, how does it destroy itself? Then it's not true either, right? It's a matter of, it does not have truth value, it has only survival value. It arose because it was useful for survival. Let's try to go to one more. Now it is definitely not working. Oop. Oh, there it went. So evolutionary psychology, I wrote natural selection. In other words, survival value. And now postmodernism. Postmodernism, what is it at its root? At its root, it says human rationality is swamped by non-rational social forces like race, class, gender, ethnicity, and so on. Well, then what about their own theory? Are they just mouthpieces for their own race, class, gender, ethnicity? And if so, why should we listen to them? Right? So Romans 1 is telling us how we can analyze any worldview that we encounter. And by the way, this is a standard tool in any philosophy toolbox. But nobody tells you why it works. My book, Finding Truth, tells you why it works and gives you a guide for how to apply it. You have to identify the idol. Once you identify the idol, you can find the reductionism, and that's the point where the worldview will be self-refuting. So Romans 1 provides the theological rationale for the arguments that everybody uses anyway. If you pick up any philosophy book, this is one of the ways that they will argue against, whatever view they're arguing against. This is a very common logical strategy. But what about Christianity? Why does it not commit suicide? Yeah, except that I'm focusing more on the human mind. God created the universe with a certain order, and he created our mind in his image to function in that created order. So that there is a congruence between the structure of the world and the structure of human cognition. So we're talking more about, why it's in Christianity we do trust reason. Remember, all these other worldviews reduce reason to something less than reason, and therefore they undercut their own case. Christians don't reduce reason because we're made in God's image. We value reason. Or as Alvin Plantinga puts it, Alvin Plantinga, he's a Christian philosopher. He says, God created both us and our world in such a way that there's a certain fit or match between the world and our cognitive faculties. So Christianity affirms the validity of human reason and rationality as part of the image of God. What's interesting is what that means is every other worldview, every other philosophy has to borrow a Christian view of knowledge. They have to assume the reliability of reason, even though their own worldview debunks reason. Otherwise, they commit suicide. Okay, so let's back up now to principle number 3. So that was number 4. This is number 3. And again, I'm going to give you lots of examples. And what you're going to see is very fascinating. It turns out that today, there are many prominent scientists and philosophers who actually acknowledge that their worldview doesn't fit the real world. And again, I'm going to focus mostly on materialism. And let's just jump straight in. With Galen Strawson, he's a leading British philosopher who claims that humans are essentially robots, right? We're created by natural forces, so we operate by natural forces. He claims the impossibility of free will can be proved with complete certainty. Do you see his reductionism? There's no free will. We're robots, basically. There's no free will. Does it fit the real world? Well, he himself says in an interview, I can't really live with this fact from day to day. Can you? Really? So watch for phrases like that. When somebody says, well, I can't live with that, he's really saying, I can't live with my own philosophy. Right? And that's the clue that the person is sensing the contradiction between what his philosophy is telling him and what his experience, as a person made in God's image and living in God's world, what that is telling him. He's experiencing that cognitive dissonance. Remember I talked about that in Romans 1? He's experiencing the cognitive dissonance between his worldview and his actual experience in the world. In fact, Strawson actually goes on and makes his point even stronger. He says, it seems that we cannot live or experience our choices as determined, even if determinism is true. The most powerful logical and metaphysical reasons for denying free will come up against equally powerful psychological reasons why we can't help believing that we do have it. Watch for phrases like that too, what we can't help believing. Our experience in this world forces us to believe certain things, even if our worldview doesn't account for it. And notice what's happening here is his own humanity is giving him evidence that he's not a robot, even though his philosophy tells him he is. His own experience is telling him, no, you are a personal being created by a personal God. And by the way, a lot of these discussions focus on free will. And I used to wonder why. Isn't that sort of just one part of human nature? But think about it. Virtually all of the distinctively human traits depend on our ability to choose. What would be some examples of things that depend on free will? Did you say relationships? Good. Yeah. Love. Love. I mean, robots don't love, right? So relationships or love. What else? Yes. Morality, that's usually the first thing people say. Moral responsibility, moral choice, moral freedom. Good. What else? Can you think of some others? Science. Yeah, how do you, well, I actually put it down as reason, but science would be one exercise of reason. Because if our minds are programmed to accept certain ideas, then obviously it's not a rational choice, a rational decision to believe what we believe. So science or reason. And any artists here? What about creativity? Right? Art is choosing what color you're going to put up there next, what note you're going to put next. So art, creativity. So free will, when you read these articles, these essays, these books, these quotes from philosophers, when they say free will, that's kind of a stand-in for all of the distinctively human traits. Let me give you another example. So this is Marvin Minsky. Is best known for his punchy phrase that the human mind, the human brain, is nothing but a 3-pound computer made of meat. Now, computers don't have free will, so the implication is neither do we. And yet, he says, we cannot live with that. He says, no matter that the physical world provides no room for freedom of will, that concept is essential to our models of the mental realm. We cannot ever give it up. Thus, we're virtually forced to maintain that belief even though we know it's false. Now, how do we know it? We know it if we're a materialist, right? He's saying, as a materialist, I know there's no such thing as free will, that claim is false, and yet we can't ever give that belief up. Now, this is a serious case of cognitive dissonance. When a concept like free will keeps bubbling up inescapably, irresistibly, unavoidably, even in the mind of someone whose worldview tells them it's false, that means they're bumping up against the truth of the created order. This is general revelation. He's recognizing general revelation and that it contradicts his own philosophy. By the way, what do they do with these truths that they can't ignore, but don't fit in their worldview? Their worldview tells them is false. Well, here's where that two-story truth comes in again. They basically create a two-story truth that we talked about this morning, or earlier today. In other words, they say, oh, these are just illusions. These are just useful fictions. We can't help believing them, but we know that they're just, they're illusions. So in the lower story, we're just meat machines, to use Dawkins, Richard Dawkins' favorite phrase, we're just meat machines. And things like free will, mind, morality, all of those things are useful fictions. Now, the problem is these two concepts are contradictory. If we really are robots operating by purely material causes, then freedom is impossible. There's no logically consistent, unified worldview that can encompass both of these statements. And that means that leading thinkers today, like Marvin Minsky's MIT, leading thinkers today have accepted a fragmented, fractured, compartmentalized, internally contradictory worldview. And people say, Christianity is irrational? This is irrational. Speaking of Richard Dawkins, I'll give you a quote from him. I think I'm going to give you a quote from him. There you go. So Dawkins also says, with survival machines, he says, we are robot vehicles blindly programmed by their genes. And he illustrates with an episode from the comedy show Fawlty Towers. Anyone know Fawlty Towers? I don't think it's on the air anymore, is it? Anyway, there's one episode that always gets a laugh. His little red car won't start. And so first he counts to 3 like a parent, before I count to 3. And then when the car still doesn't start, he picks up a branch and begins thrashing it. And the episode always gets a laugh. But then Dawkins says, why don't we laugh at a judge who punishes the criminal? Doesn't a truly scientific, mechanistic view of the nervous system make nonsense of the very idea of responsibility? Now let me show you where his self-contradiction comes in. Dawkins was promoting his latest book at a bookstore, and there was a young man there who'd read my book, Total Truth, where I give some examples like this. And so he came with a hidden microphone, and he asked Dawkins, if you think we're not really responsible for our actions, should we really be crediting you with writing this book that you're here to promote? And Dawkins backtracked immediately. This was interesting, 'cause I got to listen to the tape. So this is an example that you will hear nowhere else. He said, yes, I do respond emotionally, I do blame people, I do give people credit. But then the young man said, but my point is, don't you see this as an inconsistency in your views? And Dawkins says, I sort of do. Yes. But it is an inconsistency that we sort of have to live with. Otherwise, life would be intolerable. Isn't that amazing? He's admitting that if we lived by the worldview that Dawkins himself is promoting, life would be intolerable. By the way, I do get pushback from Christians saying, well, wait a minute. Should Christians really defend the idea of free will? Is that really biblical? We live in, you guys are Swiss, right? So we live the Reformed worldview, right? Isn't that your state church, Reformed? Yeah, but we're not Reformed. Okay, neither am I. But anyway, I'm surprised. I get this question from people who aren't even Reformed. Wait, I didn't think anyone believed this except Calvinists. But anyway, let me just clarify in case you are a Calvinist. The Reformers, Luther and Calvin, did emphasize that humans can do nothing to contribute to their salvation. And that is a wonderful doctrine, because if salvation were up to us, we would fail. But the Reformers did not mean that we cannot choose whether to have ham or turkey on our sandwich for lunch today. What the determinists are saying, these secular scientists, they're saying you only think you're choosing ham or turkey. In reality, your behavior is being driven by natural forces like neurons firing in your brain. You have no more choice than chemicals reacting in a test tube. So all Christians reject that kind of extreme reductionism. So if somebody tells you, Christians don't believe in free will, I know, I'm Lutheran. Luther wrote Bondage of the Will. But when we talk about that, we don't mean what the secular determinist means by that. So let me give you another secular determinist. So Rodney Brooks, former head of the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT. That's Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And by the way, are you noticing none of these are fringe figures? These are all leading scientists. He wrote a book called Flesh and Machines, arguing that the human being is nothing but a big bag of skin full of biomolecules interacting by the laws of physics and chemistry. Now, in ordinary life, he says, I know it's hard to see people that way. But when I look at my children, I can, when I force myself, see that they are machines. Is that how he treats them? Of course not. I interact with them on an entirely different level. They have my unconditional love, even though he then admits that love has no rational analysis within his materialist worldview. So how does he reconcile this contradiction? Well, he doesn't. Uh-oh. These got out of order. Oh, here it is. No, it's not. Somehow, I'm having to tap it multiple times. It's this one.
It's this.
Oh, it's up, it's up. Notice the last line that's added. I maintain two sets of inconsistent beliefs. So he doesn't even try to have a consistent worldview. He acknowledges that he has two, his real life forces him to have a certain set of beliefs because he loves his children, and his professional philosophy, we might say, is to be a materialist reductionist. Why would anyone accept a view so contrary to their own personal experience? The reason, and one that's so reductionist, that's so inhumane, my children are machines. Why would anyone accept a view like that? The reason is, if humans can be reduced to machines operating by natural forces, then their origin can be natural forces. So it's a way to suppress the evidence for God, just like Romans 1 says. They're suppressing the evidence for God by suppressing their knowledge of the evidence from human nature. The evidence for God from human nature. One more example. So this is Edward Slingerland. He's another evolutionist who says free will is an illusion, and yet he says it's an illusion we just can't seem to shake. No one can help acting like, and at some level really feeling, that he or she is free. We are constitutionally incapable of experiencing ourselves as robots. In fact, we're robots designed not to believe we are robots. Like, designed by who? Okay, so how does he reconcile this contradiction? Well, again, he doesn't. He says we must cultivate a dual consciousness, striving to view human beings simultaneously under two descriptions, as physical systems and as persons. In other words, he is intentionally setting up a two-story worldview, a split. He's saying, my philosophy says we're just physical systems, but we can't help acting and living as if that we really do have freedom. We are designed not to believe that we are robots. By the way, let me show you where his contradiction comes in. Again, it's his children. Evolution tells us humans are nothing but vehicles for getting our genes into the next generation. But Edward Slingerland says, the idea of my daughter as merely a complex robot carrying my genes into the next generation is both bizarre and repugnant to me. Such extreme reductionism inspires in us a kind of emotional resistance and even revulsion. In fact, he says, if you do not feel that revulsion, something's wrong with you. There may be individuals who can quite easily conceive of themselves and other people as purely instrumental, mechanistic terms, but we label such people psychopaths and quite rightly try to identify them and put them away somewhere to protect the rest of us. So what can we say when somebody urges us to adopt a view that he himself admits is bizarre and repugnant, that ought to inspire revulsion, that would justify us in locking people up if they actually believed it? This is severe cognitive dissonance. He is being driven to the logical conclusion of his idol, just as Romans 1 says. He's being pressed to the point of decision. Will he acknowledge the evidence from the created order? In this case, his daughter. She's a personal being who gives evidence of a personal creator. Or will he cling to his materialist beliefs in the face of the evidence? Now, because Christianity starts out with a transcendent creator, it does not have a box that's too small. So there's nothing that sticks out of the box. There is no two-story division. So that Christianity still affirms the unity of truth. That truth is a coherent, rationally consistent whole. So finally, we come to principle number 5. Remember, that was make the case for Christianity. You can't just make negative cases against non-Christian worldviews. What's the positive case? And let's keep the focus on the question of freedom, since that's what these philosophers are all discussing. And I would say politically, too. Today, there's more than ever, there are movements for freedom and equality and rights for various groups. And so that does create a problem. We just saw that most of the secular worldviews today, the dominant worldviews of our day, deny the reality of freedom. They give no basis for rights or dignity. You cannot have political freedom if there's no metaphysical freedom, right? If humans don't have any free will. Some of you may know Yuval Harari. Do you know Harari? Yeah. He's become sort of a name nowadays because he's one of the top advisors to the World Economic Forum. And he is a materialist, and he does argue explicitly that freedom is an illusion, and therefore democracy is doomed. If there's no free will, how can you choose? Well, here's how he puts it. Materialism makes it meaningless to talk about choosing our political leaders. Well, in that case, where did the idea of equal rights come from? Well, let's take a few quotes. This is Nietzsche. Nietzsche, the ultra-atheist philosopher, said, these great ideals come from Christianity. Another Christian concept that has passed even more deeply into the tissue of modernity is the concept of the equality of all souls before God. This concept furnishes the prototype of all theories of equal rights. It was a theory he rejected, by the way, but he knew it came from Christianity. A contemporary atheist is John Gray. And he says, Darwin has shown us that we are animals. Thus, the idea of free will does not come from science. Its origins are in religion, and not just any religion, but the Christian faith against which humanists rail so obsessively. And then he adds, any attempt to frame an atheist concept of human dignity is only a secular version of Christian faith. It's a derivative of Christianity. Not here. Where I come from in the States, Richard Rorty is one of the best known, he died recently, I should say. The late Richard Rorty was dubbed the philosopher of democracy. And yet, ironically, he says, I do not know how to justify or defend social democracy in any kind of philosophical way. So where did it come from? Oh, he says, I'm an atheist, I'm a Darwinist, I'm an evolutionist. And in the struggle for existence, the strong win out and the weak are left behind. So that cannot be the basis of equal universal rights. Instead, he says the idea originated from the biblical teaching that all human beings are created in the image of God. And he calls himself a freeloading atheist. You see the title? That's his word. He calls himself a freeloading atheist because he says, I have to freeload the concept of rights from Christianity. So what this means is that elements of the Christian worldview are so compelling and so appealing that even non-Christians keep trying to claim them. No wonder Paul says in the book of Romans that I am not ashamed of the gospel. Where did he get such confidence? From knowing that Christianity gives what everyone else wants. That Christianity alone is big enough, so to speak, to explain all of reality and to undergird human rights and dignity. Thank you. Thank you very much.